Good morning, all, and welcome to this webinar on exploring Nigeria's economic pathways, insights from the IMF's Regional Economic Outlook 2024. This webinar is brought to you by American Business Council in partnership with IMF and Nairametrics. To start the program for today, I would like to just give the webinar ground rules. If you notice your mics and cameras have been muted, please to ask a question, kindly indicate by raising your hand or asking your questions in the Q&A session. Your questions should be clear and straight to the point. Then going down straight to the key expectation. Sorry, please, there's an echo from my end. I would like to confirm where that is coming from. Thank you. So, thank you. So I've looked at the webinar ground rules. Basically, please ensure your questions and are straight to the point and clear. So to enable the panelists, the speakers, answer these questions on time. Now to the expectations for the webinar. So what we're looking at, the key expectations for the discussion. One is ensuring businesses and business groups understand the report's findings and implications for the Nigerian economy. Then secondly, the practical recommendations for addressing challenges like inflation, debt sustainability, and social inclusivity. And third is attaining clarity on areas for advocacy, especially for business groups. So to move straight to the next thing on the agenda, I would be calling on Mrs. Margaret Olile, who is the CEO and Executive Secretary of American Business Council, to give the opening remarks. I will just give a brief, I'll just read a brief profile of Mrs. Olile. So prior to her role as the CEO and Executive Secretary of American Business Council, she was the Corporate Affairs Director of Pfizer in West, East, and Southern African markets, responsible for public affairs and communication engagements. And she led this, for 3 years, the access and key accounts, as well as tenders and institution business, in addition to her corporate affairs role. She has over 25 years leadership experience in food and pharma industry, traversing public affairs, business development, regulatory communication, quality management system, auditing across Sub-Saharan Africa. Mrs. Olile, over to you, please, for the opening remarks.
Is it me? Mrs. Olile sounds a bit blurred.
Sorry, she's on mute, so we can't hear her.
Yes, I thought it was my.
Okay, so it's interesting that you could even hear me at all. Maybe I was listening for me. But again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this final economic update that we have this year. First of all, I would like to start by thanking everyone for being here, especially our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Christian Mbeke, the IMF country representative for Nigeria, and our great panelists for joining us to share their great insights today. And so for those who don't know who we are, who are just joining and are not members of the council, the American Business Council is the American Chamber of Commerce, the voice of American business, with over 90 companies that are members of the council. And the economic update, which we do every quarter, is a flagship event that shares insights on what we do and provides analysis on just keeps us ahead of the curve on insights and about the economy of the country and the relevance of these, obviously, to the private sector. So I would not want to stand between us and the panelists, but I just want to share just as a starting point that, you know, we know that looking at the economy of the country, that the inflation, you know, remains persistently high. The last time I checked, I think the headline inflation is at about 35%. You know, despite all the good intentions of the central bank's monetary measures, including obviously the continuous rise or increase in the APR. So we keep asking ourselves this question: why is inflation why is it still so high? Why are fiscal measures lagging, you know, behind these monetary actions? What are these implications for industrial stability, consumer spending, and how is this looking, you know, from a point of view of investors, you know, into the market, especially, you know, FDI? There are present concerns, you know, for businesses, policymakers, and you know, citizens alike. Again, when we look at this within the overall scope of, you know, the global shifts and all, and we're looking at how would we stand with the current economic nuance or the way we are being reflected in the face of the overall economic global map. These and a lot of others, I'm sure, are issues that our esteemed panelists would be looking at today. I'm hoping that, you know, at the end of this session, we'll be able to share or have shared understanding of the report's findings and provide some, you know, practical recommendations for strengthening Nigeria's economy, obviously, as we move into 2025. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. This is not a closing remark, but I'll just hand over to Joy. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you, Mrs. Olele, for that. We should have put you as a panelist. Okay, so sorry, there's an echo. We'll go to the next thing on the agenda. Sorry, could I check my echo? Mr. Lily, do you want to mute your mic possibly? Okay, so the next thing on our agenda would be the address by Dr. Christian Ebeke, who is the IMF resident representative for Nigeria. Prior to his appointment, he was the deputy head of the macro policy division at the IMF in Washington, D.C. He has recently led the IMF work on geoeconomic fragmentation, macrostructural reforms, and industrial policy, among other assignments. Prior to this, he served as the lead desk in the Central Africa Republic team between 2021 and 2022. Between 2017 and 2021, he was the IMF Deputy Resident Representative for the European Union in Brussels, where he led IMF work on Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, and EU-US trade tensions, EU minimum wage, and the EU climate transition. He has undertaken numerous other assignments at the IMF, including on the Euro area, Poland, and reviewing low-income country programs at the IMF. I would now invite Dr. Ebeke to please go ahead with the keynote address. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you all see my slide?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting the IMF to discuss, you know, the economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa, but with a view on what's going on really in Nigeria. I think what we are seeing in Nigeria right now is a good basis to really understand a little bit the dynamics that we see in Africa. The IMF published recently the regional economy outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa in October. So what I will try to do in this presentation is really to take you through what's going on in the entire region and what's going on in Nigeria and what could be the potential implication for policymakers. So I will take you left and right. We will be discussing, macro policies, but also structural reforms, social stability, social acceptability of reforms, and so on and so forth. The title of our regional economic outlook this year is Reforms Amid Great Expectations. And I think that title resonates very well with the situation that we see in Nigeria currently, where the administration has undertaken significant reforms. I think people have different views about the sequencing or maybe the opportunities of this reform, but at the IMF, our view is that Nigeria was in a very precarious situation prior to these reforms. The reform have had an impact that is significant in the economy, but also led to some dislocation in some part of the economy. We'll be discussing this. So there is really time to have a sequencing that is appropriate for the average Nigerian citizen to ensure that the reform drive can really deliver the intended benefits. So let me start with the first point, which is that Africa, we are all Africans in the room, and sometimes there is a mistake to think that Africa is just one block. I think these two charts that you see here clearly shows that there is a divergence in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is one region, but there are two paths that we can clearly see. The left chart will show you that in per capita terms, real GDP in the non-resource intensive countries, so the country without significant natural resources, they have actually grown faster than the resource-rich countries such as Nigeria or Angola. You can clearly see that there is a clear divergence in the trajectory of per capita GDP or per capita income in the two blocks. And this divergence has really widened over the past 10 years, right? The divergence really started in 2015, right after the commodity price shock, and the resource-rich countries have really struggled to catch up with the non-resource intensive countries. Then the question is, why so, right? Why is that the richer countries in terms of potential actually doing less or worse than the ones without resource endowments? The right-hand side chart shows you that, across several metrics that are key for long-term development or productivity, you can see that fuel exporters, right, countries like Nigeria or Libya or Angola or Gabon, they're actually scoring very poorly on these different metrics. When you look at governance, which is key, the fuel exporting countries have a lower score in terms of governance, lower score in terms of political stability, in terms of business environment, and on some of other metrics like access to electricity or secondary school enrollment, they're doing relatively well compared to, as other countries. But on some of the key metrics, as I mentioned, governance, the business climate or political stability, the performance is really lackluster. When we talk about inflation, I think the first remarks was really about the recent release in inflation in Nigeria, but it's also a broader phenomenon in many other countries. The good news is that inflation has decelerated in many African countries, as you can see from the left-hand side charts, right? But for many other countries, including Nigeria, inflation remains a significant challenge. But yesterday, we learned that overall inflation accelerated again to 34.6% in November 2024. But this is clearly the highest in 26 years for Nigeria. So Nigeria is still struggling to stabilize inflation at a level that will be consistent with higher growth, but also higher social inclusion. And you can also see from the right-hand side chart that there is a significant heterogeneity in inflation performance in Africa. You have countries that have, a fixed exchange rate regime. We call them the PEG country. They have a much lower average inflation, but the one with, flexible exchange rate regime have struggled recently to really stabilize inflation. Clearly, inflation can manifest also in terms of food prices. You can see that overall for Africa, food prices are just trending upward, right? So there is no clear sense here that food prices are decelerating across the board, and this is causing significant hardship. one of the reasons why food prices remain elevated is clearly the climate shocks that we saw, right? The floods in Nigeria, during the summer this year, but also the recent increase in PMS price at the pump. Those are supply side shocks that have really impacted food prices and worsened food insecurity. For Nigeria, we learned yesterday that food inflation accelerated to close to 40%. And, across 19 Nigerian states, we see food inflation above 40%. This is clearly a significant shock for many, many households when you see 19 Nigerian states out of 36 that pose food inflation above 40%. Well, the immediate implication of this trend is that for Nigeria, food insecurity has really increased over the past few years. Over the past 5 years, clearly, we see now food insecurity at about 32 million people. And poverty is expected to increase this year in 2024 to 47%. And those estimates actually predate the recent increase in food price at the pump or recent struggle in the currency. So again, food insecurity coupled with poverty, those are significant shocks impacting the average Nigerian, the middle class, but also the most vulnerable. We all know what has happened to our currency in Nigeria. The Naira depreciated, but Nigeria is not alone in that group. You also have countries like Angola, where we saw significant devaluation in the currency. But recently, we have also noticed a relative stability, at least in the official segment of the market. I know that Zeli is in the room and can talk more about the reforms that have been implemented to really stabilize the FX market, but something that we at the IMF are really interested in, and we really have welcome the recent policy implementation is really the new electronic FX matching platform introduced in December this year. And we think at the fund that this platform will significantly improve transparency in the market, will reduce information asymmetry in FX demand and supply. Now it's going to be clearer for people to see the volume that they are being traded, the quotes also that are being posted on the platform. Overall, this is expected to strengthen FX price discovery. And we also know that in addition to fixing the market structure, the value of the Naira will also depend on the policy mix that is being implemented, both on the monetary policy side and fiscal policy side. Is also going to depend a lot on how much Nigeria can really tap in terms of FX flows from his hydrocarbon sectors. So again, very important to think about inflows in terms of FX in the market, improving the FX structure, which is what the central bank is doing, but also having a policy mix that makes a lot of sense with fiscal and monetary policy looking into the same direction, ensuring that one leg does not really work at the cross purpose of what the other leg is doing. For many African countries, including Nigeria, funding needs remain very high. The left-hand side chart that you see shows you that over the past really 15 years, we have seen a significant increase in principal and interest repayment by countries. Those are the darker part of the histogram that you see. So to maintain just the same level of flows that we have seen, for example, last year in Africa, country will need to really attract significant amount of FX inflows in their countries. And you can see from this same left-hand side chart that the dark line shows you overall a downward trend in the capacity of country to really attract external funding flows into the public sector. On the right-hand side chart, you see that for many countries, external debt service payment is a significant portion of their domestic revenue. So the share of external debt service into domestic revenue mobilization is actually trending upwards. So this is again a measure of liquidity pressure that many countries in Africa face. And you know that this is not something new to Nigeria. Right now, our projections show that interest payment over tax revenue in Nigeria are around 68%. It's a reduction from the high numbers that we saw over the past few years. But again, when you have close to 70% of your tax revenue that you use to repay just interest on your debt, you have little left to really, embark on development spending, on security spending, on education, health, infrastructure, but also social protection. An important variable for Nigeria to watch for next year is really the gross financing needs. Our estimate is that those gross financing needs for Nigeria as a whole could reach 9.5% of GDP in 2025, and this is up from 7.2% of GDP in 2024. This is about 1 trillion additional gross financing needs that the country will need to either roll over or really address next year when those repayments are due. Overall, there is a significant heterogeneity in GDP growth rate in Africa. You can see the distribution for 2024 on the top chart here. Nigeria is just among the other countries in the histogram just on the left. Nigeria GDP is expected to grow at 3.2% this year. And next year, we expect growth to be roughly the same, around 3.1%. Again, with population growth that is a little bit around 2.5% in per capita term, this is just too little to make a meaningful impact on the average population. So again, Nigeria needs to grow much faster and in a more durably manner to really have an impact on social indicators. The outlook is not really great in terms of risk. I think the risks are really tilted to the downside. We know the damage that climate shocks do to many African countries, including Nigeria. We saw this again this year with the floods. We also see high volatility in commodity prices, and Nigeria is a country that relies a lot on the hydrocarbon sector. So commodity price shocks clearly have a detrimental impact on Nigeria balance of payment, but also fiscal accounts. And the outlook also for advanced economies, which are the trading partners of countries like Nigeria, there is a slowdown, a risk of a slowdown in advanced economies next year, which could then impact Nigeria via the trade channel. And financial markets could become more volatile given geoeconomic fragmentation risk, but also geopolitical tensions. So when those risks materialize, it's going to be very difficult for countries to be able to manage these while maintaining coherent macroeconomic stability at home. So what can be done given this outlook and those risks? We think that it's going to be about managing difficult trade-offs, right? Because fiscal space is squeezed for many countries. Development needs are really high. At the same time, countries will have to respond to social pressures given the ongoing economic hardship. So choices are not easy. But inaction is definitely not an option. So for many Sub-Saharan African leaders, including in Nigeria, the trade-off or the balancing act that they have to face is really, first, strengthening economic stability. Macro stability is clearly essential. But at the same time, they have to respond to growing social pressures. But then they also have tremendous development needs in terms of infrastructure, in terms of social protection, education, health, and so on and so forth. So all of it in the backdrop of social frustration, political pressure that require a better use of even the scarce public resources that are available. So this is again a very challenging environment for many policymakers, including in Nigeria. So Africa as a whole, has increasingly witnessed political fragility, but also social unrest recently. You can see from the map on the left that many countries either were impacted by conflict or coup. Several countries were also impacted by social tensions, including in Nigeria, this year. So for Africa, the context in which macro policy implementation takes place is a very difficult context, right? A country like Nigeria is surrounded by countries where you have military regimes and where you do not really have clear certainty about the direction of policies going forward. But even at home here in Nigeria, there is a growing sense that the government needs to do more and accelerate support to the most vulnerable, given that social frustration is rising. So how to fine-tune the policy mix? Let me start with monetary policy. Clearly in Africa, countries are different and they are in different positions in the economic cycle. But for countries with still elevated inflation as Nigeria, our view is that it will be important to maintain a tightening policy stance, right? I understand in Nigeria, there is clearly a debate between what are the drivers of inflation, between, a supply side or cost push inflation or demand push inflation. But regardless of the balance, even if it's 50-50 supply and demand shocks, is still important for the central bank to maintain credibility and to maintain a tightening stance until inflation is durably brought down and converge towards the target. We still expect inflation in Nigeria next year to come down. We see inflation around 28% average compared to the current level next year. And this is again thanks to also the tremendous effort by the Central Bank of Nigeria to refocus its mandate on really bringing inflation down and promote macroeconomic stability. For those countries with near target inflation, we think that on the continent, they can gradually ease to a more neutral stance in close cooperation, obviously, with other policies like fiscal policy. On the fiscal policy side, clearly the need is to ensure debt sustainability, but also addressing spending pressure. So again, the view at the fund is not only about bringing debt or improving primary fiscal balance, but once you expand your fiscal space, what do you do with it? You can see from the right-hand side chart that for many, many countries in Africa, the risk of debt distress has really, really increased over the past 10 years. We started in 2015 with 6 countries with high risk of debt distress and 2 countries that were already in distress. Now, these numbers is close to 20 countries that are either in distress already or face a risk of face a high debt risk. Nigeria is in the gray part. Risk are moderate. Risk of debt distress are moderate for Nigeria, but again, Nigeria is not out of the wood. Maintaining this rating or bringing this rating up in terms of better debt sustainability will require reducing fiscal slippages, including through domestic revenue mobilization. I think the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reform has put together very, very interesting tax bills to modernize the tax system in Nigeria, but also bring more revenue. We also think that for Nigeria, there is a huge potential that emanates from the potential saving from the removal of the implicit fuel subsidies. We all know what happened in October 2nd. The full deregulation of the downstream sectors in Nigeria has the potential to bring into public coffers between 1.5 and 2% of GDP in terms of savings. So those savings provide a significant boost if they materialize, meaning if NNPC is able to transfer these savings into the government's account, and it will be a good fiscal inflows to really expand fiscal space for development spending. Again, the resources that are generated from all this effort, we think that they should be used more they should be used to really strengthen social protection, but also address the infrastructure gap in Nigeria. But making reforms is not easy, right? It's actually even more difficult when there is no social contract or when there is a lack of trust between the population and policymakers. The right-hand side chart that you see here is based on Afrobarometer recent survey, where Afrobarometer asks citizens in nearly many African countries if they will agree or disagree whether their government use taxes for the well-being of citizens. You can see that there is huge heterogeneity across countries in Africa. You have countries like Tanzania, where 75% of people that are surveyed say that their government indeed use taxes for the well-being of citizens, so the money is used more productively. For countries like Nigeria, which is on the left now, you can see that just a little bit above 25% or 30% of respondents disagree or agree. So the majority actually disagree in Nigeria that government uses taxes for the well-being of citizens. But again, Nigeria is not alone there. You can also see other rich countries like Angola, where the majority actually disagree that taxes are being used for development or for the well-being of citizens. So this absence of social contract is a key impediment to reform implementation, because it leads to lack of trust, and the forward guidance that you have may not work. So we think at the IMF that there is a clear need to use fiscal policy to promote inclusion. And one thing that should not be neglected, which is actually at the core of this strategy, is really a focus on communication, right? It's very important that the reforms are well communicated, and that consultations take place with various stakeholders in many of these countries where deep reforms are implemented. It's also very important to think about the sequencing of reforms, right? A subsidy reform, for example, without a clear social safety net in place that works, run the risk of creating more dislocation and reduce acceptability of the reform. So it's very important always to think about difficult reform with compensatory measures, for example, social protection, to ensure that any dislocation, potential dislocation that can be triggered by the reform or the policy measure can actually be addressed through either transfer to the most vulnerable household, but also other measures to ensure that the purchasing power of the most vulnerable is protected. There's also a need, as you do reform, to be your own student, right? To preach by example or to lead by example. So that's why a fair and transparent management of public resources is key. So the population will see leaders doing reform, but they also expect the leaders to be more transparent, to also use the resource more productively. So managing corruption, addressing the mismanaging of public resources is key, again, to strengthen the social contract. And in Nigeria, we think that rebuilding the social contract will help further advance the needed reforms that are still needed for the country. So let me stop here, and happy to answer any question or listening to the panel that's just going to take place after me. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for that insightful presentation. I think one thing that stood out for me, especially this Christmas period, is that food inflation is above 40%. So now we'll just go straight to the panel because we're running a bit behind time. So I will just introduce the panelist, the moderator, who is Feyi Fawehimi, who is an economist and a consultant. He'll be moderating the panel session, and the panel, which is on driving macroeconomic stability and sustainable growth in Nigeria. With him, the various panelists for this session, we have Olusegun Zaccheaus, who is a partner and West African lead strategy and PwC. Then we have Mrs. Fumi Ogunlesi, who is the head of government affairs, Sub-Saharan Africa, and a director at Citibank Limited. We have Zil Akaraiwe, who is the CEO, Garamel Black Advisory. And we have Professor Bongo Adi, who is a professor of economics at Lagos Business School, Pan Atlantic University. So over to you, Feyi, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joy. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on driving macroeconomic stability and sustainable growth in Nigeria. My name is Feyi Fawehimi. Privileged to be the moderator for this conversation. Nigeria's economic trajectory is at a very pivotal moment, as highlighted in the highlights of the reports that we just saw from Dr. Kristen. Nigeria faces significant challenges not limited to balancing fiscal reforms, addressing inflationary pressures, and ensuring debt sustainability. And obviously, I think maybe most critical of all, fostering inclusive growth, just so that, the growth is not just happening in one corner while everyone else is left to fend for themselves. So hopefully, I'm hoping that at the end of this session that you at least leave with something. It would not be possible for us to have all the answers to Nigeria's myriad problems in just one session like this, but hopefully you will leave with something. So without wasting too much time, I think we're just going to get into it. Now, my first question, I'm going to direct this at Zil, and I think just to set the scene, I don't want it to sound like we're doing the easy thing, whereby someone has done something, then we then just look back and say, oh, you should have done it this way, especially when it becomes difficult. But, what we're trying to do here is try to have a retrospective and just look back and say, okay, here's what we may have learned from the way these things were done. Not just to say, oh, it should have been done differently, but just in case that in future we might have to do something, similar like that again, we can think through it better. So my first question would be, now we know from history that what we called subsidy in Nigeria was really a kind of hedge, a naked hedge, effectively, because it was intrinsically tied to the exchange rate. So the Nigerian government was protecting Nigerians from not just the changes in the price of crude oil, but the changes in the exchange rate as well. So you had this double kind of subsidy, which we all wrapped up under fuel subsidy. Now, obviously, if you were going to change that, they were kind of interlinked. So my first question would be this: did Nigeria move too quickly on liberalizing the exchange rate and removing the fuel subsidy, given that these two things are very linked and one affects the other? So I think just as a broad thing, do you think that we moved too quickly? And if maybe in future we're confronted about the same thing, maybe we might have moved slowly or done one first before the other one?
Thank you, Faye. Your opening kind of makes it difficult to answer the question without. Well, I know what you mean, and I agree with you entirely. So, long time ago, I had a surgery back in the days when they still use stitches. Right, I had and in removing the plaster, which was massive, the nurse was gisting with me and distracting me, and she yanked it off once. It was, I don't know which was more painful, the surgery or the removal of the plaster. But I found out later that that's the best way to remove a plaster. You take the pain once and for all, and that's it, which is what Nigeria did. Okay. However, the nurse would not have done that without having the tools in case something went wrong. If you yank off the plaster and the stitches rip, you don't say, oh dear, we had no choice, they bleed to death, which is a slightly different circumstance. Regarding fuel subsidy in particular, it's not something you can remove gradually. Otherwise, from the moment you announce a gradual removal, you're going to have a perpetual scarcity because everybody's waiting to maximize the profit. The way it was done is the most efficient way it had to be done. I think there are a couple of things we should have done before yanking the plaster off. So I'll give an example. As at April 2023, just after the elections were won and before swearing in, the oil curve was in significant backwardation. Now, why that is important is that if we had taken a hedge from Q2 2023 all the way to
sorry. When you say the oil curve was in backwardation,
okay, sorry.
You mean that prices were projecting to come down in future?
If you were to look into future contracts to buy oil or oil-related products, as you go out into the future, the prices came down.
Okay.
So it was cheaper to buy fuel 2 years in advance than to buy it immediately. And so if we had gone into those contracts out to 2026, on an average cost, and remember I'm referring to April 2023 when the exchange rate was still below 500. on an average cost and using 750 as the exchange rate at that time, we would have been able to fix the price of petrol below 500 naira all the way to 2026 without a subsidy. And that is the purpose of financial hedges, to remove the pain from the government, remove it from the citizens, toss it into a financial instrument. Now, those are some of the things that going forward, like you said, Faye, if we have to do this again, maybe we should look at the social contracts, be prepared, and then take financial contracts to remove the burden from the government and make sure it's not passed onto the citizens arbitrarily. So those are some of the examples of things that could have been done before the removal. But in terms of the manner of removal, we honestly didn't have too many options regarding whether we're going to do it gradually or at once.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. I think I probably tend to agree with you as well. So, well, now we are in the plaster has been removed phase, and there's a lot of pain, So
And the stitches are wet.
exactly, and I'm not seeing, and forgive me, I'm outside of Nigeria, and but I'm not seeing a lot of well thought through or clearly or cleverly targeted relief. So beyond things like CNG initiative, which I'm very, very doubtful about that, as a technology, I always ask myself, if the thing is so good, why is everyone not doing it? I know in Malaysia, for example, they had a big push to try and do that. And then earlier this year, they said, we're walking back from this. And so they're now rolling back the whole CNG thing. So beyond CNG, beyond, if you have a couple of ideas in terms of, pain relief, basically, beyond just what kind of pain relief can we have now that we have decided that, taking this out one time is probably the best thing to do. Now we have to go forward and try and ease the suffering on people.
Well, I think, you see, it's not it's not easy to talk about that without talking about the purchasing power of the people. If you make a decision that the price of such an important commodity goes beyond the purchasing power of the people, then the conversation should have been had beforehand regarding improving the purchasing power of the people. I agree with you. I'm confused about the CNG initiative. I suspect it's one of those things where the government has said, instead of doing nothing, let's do something. It might not be the optimal. It's one of those something is better than nothing solutions. But in terms of, for example, in terms of mass transportation, there hasn't been, in my opinion, enough effort towards that. So mass transportation removes the burden of petrol. And by mass transportation, I'm referring more to things like rail and buses that use diesel, even because diesel prices were deregulated a long time ago. So in terms of making things easier for people, can people move around without necessarily driving or taking expensive transportation? All those things were not, in my opinion, outside of Lagos, of course, as a national project, have we really looked at that and said, well, those are things that will take a couple of years, which is why I said if we had done the hedge to 2026, it would have given the government 3 years and said, we're fixing the price at here. There's no subsidy anymore. But in 3 years, we're going to roll out mass transportation. You're going to see significant progress on rail transport. You're going to see changes from the savings on minimum wage. Those are the kind of social contracts that make people say, okay, it's worth the suffering now, because in 2 or 3 years, we'll start to reap the benefits. And those things are trackable.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. So I think Professor Adi has dropped off. So I'm just going to skip the question I was going to ask him. I'll go to, and when he comes back, I'm going to go to you for me now. The broad outline of this question is around fiscal credibility and wasteful spending. Now, I know you are with Citi, and Citi have probably the most experienced bank in Nigeria in terms of, taking the Nigerian government to the international markets and all that. So, what I want to ask you is around things like, basically, if we can put it like under the banner of the word on the streets. What are you hearing from investors who are playing an important role in allowing the government to get by in terms of lending to them, but things like all our fiscal consolidation efforts at the moment seem to be focused on raising revenues The conversations around the other side of the ledger, which is basically not just even wasteful spending, but in terms of prioritizing spending to ensure that 1 naira is 1 naira. It's fungible, but that we are making the right choices in terms of how we spend that 1 naira, even if you are taking it from one place and even if you're just simply taking it from one place and putting it in another place, rather than eliminating that at all. What kind of reforms do you think are necessary to give Nigeria a better fiscal credibility, so that we can't take for granted that investors will always buy our bonds? Now they are buying it, but what if they see things in future that might make them to change their mind? So, from your point of view, what are those kind of fiscal reforms, or reforms that generally to maintain and keep that credibility going in the future?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Faye?
Yes, I can hear.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to have a quick mention to Zeal about the wisdom, and I agree it would have been great if Nigeria had been able to take out a fiscal instrument to be able to hedge against some tough policy decisions that they could see would roil markets and have impacts on costs of living and so on. But it's extremely difficult in emerging markets. I don't know many African countries that have successfully, maybe apart from Ghana, and even within the emerging markets, maybe Mexico, you would know better than me, to sell, because those types of instruments require Federal Executive Council approval, National Assembly approval, for appropriateness tests and so on. You know better than me, Zeal. Very difficult. So within the timing that they had of winning the elections and deciding they wanted to remove the fuel subsidy, it would have been highly challenging for them to have been able to remove this. That's just a side comment. Faye, to your comment about, and you're absolutely right, that as Christian said in the REO, and as has been said in the Regional Economic Outlook, yes, the capital markets are cautiously open, right? And they had not been open for Nigeria since 2022. But have, as you mentioned, Monday, 2nd of December, we went to the market, and it was by every account a very successful day for Nigeria's outing, to the extent that the order book reached 9 billion. They were in the market for 2.2 billion. And as I said, I think there was some scarcity value. The country had not been to the market since 2022. A few other African countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya had been. And so I think the market was kind of waiting for Nigeria. But as Christian mentioned, those markets are not guaranteed, as we saw immediately during and after COVID. And the whole we're in an extremely volatile geopolitical environment right now. So, and something happens in Ukraine or Russia or Syria, and investors sort of fly to safety. And with all the best intentions of the world, we're not the safest of the emerging markets, just in terms of our rating and so on. So I agree with you that but as I say, it was a very good outing. We had, Citi was one of the joint lead managers with 3 other excellent institutions. And what struck us as we were looking through the investor meetings was this point you made about efficient spending and about the need, nobody was in doubt about Nigeria's potential. With all the headwinds and all the difficulties that we've gone through in the last several years, we're still amongst the top 30 economies globally. Maybe we've slipped beyond 30. And it used to be said that Nigeria is one of the next 11 after the BRICS, ranking with South Korea and so on in those days. Not so long ago, Mr. Zacchaeus is laughing, but not so long ago. So obviously, there has been inefficiency. For us as bankers, and for anybody within the professional and corporate sector, one of the greatest ways to promote efficiency is data. I know everybody is going to talk about, they're wasting money, they're in Abuja, the legislators and so on, but moving away from, the chit chat and saying, okay, what can we do as a country efficiently to kill several birds with one stone, increase the trust between the populace and the people, so that they're willing to take a bit more of that pain and avoid what the IMF called adjustment fatigue. Because right now everybody's adjusted fatigued. So how do you keep persuading people as Margaret said in her opening, all the tightening, the MPC, doing the right things has not actually brought down inflation. And how do people not get frustrated when they see the latest figures? The fact is, let's start with the base case that some very sound reforms have taken place on monetary, on the removal of fiscal subsidy. I know a lot of people say, oh, we should have done A, B, C, D. But I think I agree with Zeal that, pulling off the plaster, because by the time you say you forward guide the market that I'm going to in 3 months, all sorts of chaos might step in, and people would also want to step in to prevent it. So maybe the plaster removal. But at the same, so you've got these reforms that have happened, some good reforms. People will say, okay, but it hasn't panned out. One point to note is that the previous decade did not have, we're trying to make up for several years of not so strong reform environments, let me put it that way, under previous administrations, and not just Mr. Buhari's administration, but even before, where a lot of cans were kicked down the reform road. And so I think it's a combination of, one, we ran out of runway, and two, yes, some courageous people, and there are some courageous technocrats in this government that we should try to also encourage. For me, the starting point in removing waste is to say, okay, let us measure. Like, what do we have? What are our genuine statistics? It's to beef up the Bureau of Statistics to say, what are the core reasons for why we are not yet trending down on inflation, for us to be very sure that we're actually in the right direction. And then in terms of government spending, do we really know what we're spending on? And that it is, let's avoid some of the things, or the Jeeps and so on. Let's avoid some of those types of things, but look at the core spending. Any corporate, bank, financial institution, manufacturing industry worth its value is able to tell you, at the press of a button, what they are spending, what they brought in real terms. Otherwise, they go bankrupt. What their actual core revenue really is. What did they sell? What is the mix of my revenue, and what am I really spending on? So I think for me and for us, a lot of people, a lot of professional and private sector, it's not so much the wastefulness as the inefficiency. We send money, but it doesn't hit the target of what it's meant to do. People complain that there's been no money spent on palliatives, or very little. I'm sure if we measure and do the statistics, a lot of money has been spent, but maybe it didn't get where it was supposed to do. Not always necessary because of corruption, but sometimes by sheer wastefulness. So a couple of suggestions would be, let's improve our data management. It was a recommendation from some investors during the roadshow that we need more efficient data. When we go online to Ministry of this or Ministry of that, we want up-to-date data. There used to be, I believe there probably still is, an efficiency unit in Nigeria that was set up by previous administration to look and track government spending. And I would suggest, I understand that for whatever you think of Mr. Musk, that he's going to be heading an efficiency unit for the United States. So if the United States wants to track what it's spending on, I think Nigeria might want to also look at data, measurement, tracking, and then to say, is this the best use of our money? And as Christian said, communication, publish accounts. I think the elephant in the room is the NNPC. Publish what's coming in, what's going out, and so on. One of the comments on the roadshow, or the investor meetings, was, we really want to be able to trust NNPC data, because for us, that's the crown jewel. So we want to trust your data. And you have in your budget an assumption that you will be producing 2 million barrels of oil per day. We're far from that. Why? I mean, and if you're not going to, have you gone to do an adjustment? Those is, people begin to see, and you're publishing, you're signaling, you're communicating a more efficient way of running government. That's from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's, like I agree with you. We tend to focus on how much the legislators are earning in Abuja, how many jeeps we have. Those things don't really move the dial. Sunlight being a disinfectant would actually be a far more useful reform idea here. Thanks a lot. All right. Come to you now. I want to pick your strategy brain on this one now. We have the perennial problem, right? A politician is elected, you need to do things. So take education is my best example of this now. You're elected for a 4-year term. Anything you do in terms of education now, it might only show up in 16 years. By that time you'll be long gone. So you are constantly balancing the short term, what will win you the next election, with the long term, what will actually make the country a better place, even when you are no longer there. So Nigerians, always caught in this trap. How do we balance counter-cyclical short-term policies to stabilize the immediate pressures? So things like, for example, food inflation is biting. It is actually biting right now. So we need to do something about that, stabilize that. But then the long-term structural reforms, sometimes they might clash. What you need to do for the long term might actually maybe push food inflation up from, say, 40% to 45% before it then starts to come down. How do we balance those two? From a strategy point of view, how does a country like Nigeria, think that boosting agricultural productivity, shifting us away from oil to non-oil exports, because, we know that oil is not going to be here forever, and general economic diversification to protect us from all this kind of wild swing. So what, in your view, is the optimal sequence for policy implementation?
Thanks a lot, Faye. Good to see everyone. That question you just asked is an interesting question, and a couple of things that I think policymakers need to understand, right? I think one dimension is the gap between input and output, right? For every policy input you have, you need to have a clear understanding on the timeline before you get an output or result or outcome that you want. That's point number one. Point number two is then the point around the ease of implementation of whatever policy choices you're making, right? And you need to have a very good view of those things and then tie that to what outcome you're trying to get. Look, there's some things that will not happen in the next 4 years, no matter what you do, right? And so it takes a long lag time for those policies to come to reality. But there are issues that you need to address in the short term to create stability. So for me, a proper way to frame sequencing is to ask yourself the question, what are the things that drives for stability in the short term? What are things that drives for longer term growth in the long term, right? And you then need to say, how do you balance both? And let me give you an example. Like you said, right? There's a problem around inflation, right? Inflation issue is both, as Christian said, both structural and a bit monetary, right? The question you must ask yourself, can you fix the structural issues in the short term? My clear answer will be no, right? Because it takes a bit of while. You can start, but you can't get all the result in the short term. But on the monetary side, are there things you can do in the short term? Yes, there are things you can do, which I think is what the government is doing now, right? But that's on one side. Then you then look at the issue of growth, development, etc. And my advice to government, look, you can't drive development until you have some sense of economic stability, right? So for me, we talk about capex, etc. I think everything around government spending on capex, etc. They're good, but they're not going to do us good in the short term. So what should government focus on? You think about it. What can you fix, right? So let's talk about the FX market, right? And the issues around transparency, friction in the market, and liquidity, right? But what you can fix in the short term is around price discovery and transparency in the market. Reducing the friction of transaction. That has been done. From the fiscal side, when you look at the question around business environment and the market, the question you must ask yourself as a policy authority, what can I fix that does not even require so much investment or capex spending that has a good disproportionate impact on me? So there are sectoral reforms that we need to have over-invested in to get sorted. And we've seen a bit of progress around that, especially from oil and gas sector. What can you do and do it well and ensure it creates transparency to attract foreign investors? So for me, maybe sort of summarize this. So is that thinking to ask the question, what is the timeline between your action and the result you want? So really you need to sequence the policy from address the things that bite, very hard now, and which is to talk about inflation, do sectoral and business reforms that can create a good impression with investors, and we begin to see those flows coming. And I think the third point, which we've alluded to, but I see them as 2 points, is around a sense of consistency in the policy action, right? And the second point is around communication, and the third point is around alignment. Let me talk about consistency. I think one of the things the government must do right is to ensure that you don't relapse on policy choices that have been made, because that sets you back, far, right? The second point is around communication. It's the clear communication on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we're going to get from it, right? I think that needs to be elevated, right? I think the last point around this is to talk about the alignment around policy between the fiscal, the monetary, and even from a sectoral perspective, right? Fiscal has to do what it has to do. It has to do social intervention to address the issue of high inflation, or wage that is not increasing as fast as inflation, right? Monetary has to do what it has to do in a way to drive inflation, right? But the question you must ask is that how do you ensure there's an alignment around the policy choices that is being made, so that we can have a better counter-cyclical. Obviously, monetary want to address inflation, which may slow down growth. Then how does fiscal address this, right? I think for me, that's the third point. And there should be a bit more alignment between the policy choices, between the monetary and fiscal, in a way that the outcome is optimal, right? Which is saying you need to address inflation, you must, right, to create stability, but you need to ensure there's social intervention to reduce or address the social pressure that could potentially come from it. But economic growth, maybe in the short term, you have to make a sacrifice of that, right? So that's my broad thoughts around this. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It reminds me of something politicians here in the UK like to say, that 90% of what a government does goes unreported, right? So you are going to be judged by 10% of the stuff you do, but the 90% are actually important. So the things like the boring stuff, like civil service reforms, education, that sort of thing, they will never make the headline, but a tiny thing. So you are constantly balancing that 90-10, whereby, the 10 might not be as important as 90, but then it can derail everything else you're doing. Okay, cool. Now my next question, I want to something a bit more topical, which will take in tax reform, which is a big topic at the moment. But this is industrial sector support and tax reform. I mean, we are constantly supporting industries in Nigeria. We can do it, sometimes do it in very odd ways, and lobbying plays a big role in that. But to the extent that we can agree that having an industrial sector is important. Now, sometimes it can be overplayed in the sense that even China, which is a manufacturing power, for example, at least for the past 4 decades, as far as I know, the services sector in China has actually been bigger than the industrial sector. But there's something romantic about industrial something, making stuff, having output, but then also developing skills and earning and paying your way in the world. Essentially, you make stuff, you can export it, and you earn the foreign exchange you need. So to that extent, however small the industrial sector is, or manufacturing, or all that sort of thing, it would always need some kind of support. So the question now is, what supportive policies are critical to revitalizing Nigeria's industrial sector, in the sense that, we can tell, we know that it is going through a very, very tough time, just to put it mildly. Specifically, how can we get government to address those challenges like energy shortages, which is a big deal. In fact, like I mentioned, I don't live in Nigeria, but I was in Nigeria earlier this year, probably around March, and I'm planning another trip in a few weeks as well. And something I paid for in March this time around, the last time, I asked for the price again, and I was completely shocked by it's more than doubled, and when I asked them what's going on, and they tell me it's energy. It's energy that is the big driver of that change. So, big energy shortages, export competitiveness. We have challenges with our ports, but thankfully, I think we are getting options in the sense that you can have the Lekki deep sea port now. Things can be exported through there, and funding access, which is the bane of a lot of everyone needs more funds, or they need access to more funds, and they need access to funds that don't cost 30% interest, basically, in there. So, but finally, and this is the joint question, a separate and joint question, which for this one, I want all of us to go. So I'm going to start with you, Zil. But we're currently having a debate around tax, and it's progressing through. In general, I think I'm supportive of the ideas behind that. But what I want to ask you is this: let us assume that those tax bills, they all pass through and they are all implemented as intended, or as perfectly as is possible in a country like Nigeria. What should be the outcome by which we measure them in 5-10 years time, in terms of, what do we think should happen, and linking that to our industrial sector? How does that tax reform agenda, if it all goes well, how should that support that? So I know it's a lot of in there, I think, but to summarize, the first part of it is that, how do we support the industrial sector to the extent that it is worth supporting and keeping as a critical part of Nigeria? And then we're currently having a tax reform debate as well. Where do those two come together? And in a perfect world, how would our tax reform agenda support that? So, I'm going to start with you. Yeah.
Okay. To start with, I would quote something Winston Churchill said a long time ago. And he said something along the lines that for a nation to try to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket trying to lift himself up by the handle, right? I'm a citizen, and every time the government collects my tax, I feel a pinch, because there's a fiduciary responsibility on their side. I must pay my taxes. Let's not get that twisted, right? But there's a fiduciary responsibility on the side of the government as well. And what I've noticed when it comes to, again, I'm careful about all the defamation issues going on in Nigeria. When it comes to government collecting taxes, you see, they get the absolutely best brains with the best innovation, with the best technology. They link all sorts of things. And it's amazing, when it comes to spending that tax on a social safety net for my benefit, you start to hear of quota systems and people, and you're like, this is not how it works. Taxes ought to be paid, in my opinion. I think in my interaction with all the tax agencies and what I know living here, I think there's a lot of leakage in the tax revenue, right? That just blocking those leakages, in my opinion, could triple the government revenue just by blocking the leakages. That's one. Two, and I think this is crucially important, we need to redefine tax. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. As far as the government is concerned, tax is the money, right, from the citizens into its coffers, right? As a citizen, tax is everything I pay that I should be giving to government. Whether it gets to government or not is a separate conversation. And I'll use a very simple example. You go into Lagos Island, I pay for parking. That's government revenue. That's a tax on me, but it's not, that's a tax on me. It's a payment I make, but it doesn't count as government revenue. If the government has outsourced its responsibility to individuals out of its own inefficiency, that should not mean I bear a bigger burden. Another simple example, Faye, looking at everybody on the panel, I believe most of us went to one federal government college or the other if we schooled in Nigeria, right? Now, as far as I'm concerned, because the quality of education has dropped below the acceptable global standard, I am forced, it's not an option I have for the future of my kids, I'm forced to send my children to a private school. As far as I am concerned, that's a tax, because I'm paying for something the government should, but it is not revenue to government. So if we redefine tax and put the responsibility on government to collect the money we are paying, then you're going to find, I'll give you another example. my car has had a knocked engine 3 times in 5 years. It's a 2017 model car, right? And the reason is the same, bad fuel. As far as I'm concerned, all that money I've paid because the government agencies are not ensuring the right quality of importation of petrol over the years. As far as I'm concerned, that's a tax I'm paying, but it's not revenue to government. So when we need to holistically look at tax and say there are many things the government can do to exponentially increase their revenue without adding additional burden to the citizens. Now, regarding the industrialization you are talking about, what is it that industries need? We like to tout ease of doing business and all of that, and that's important, but I know a lot of that ease of doing business is around the law and documentation, not actually about performing business activities. But a lot of these industries need a lot of policy clarity. I'll give an example. One of my clients were discussing some policy. This was maybe 5 or 6, before COVID anyway. And he was explaining to me that he makes plastics. He said the tax he pays on importing the raw materials, plus the tax he pays on the machinery, plus all the other taxes he pays on the packaging stuff, it came to just under 20% at the time. I think it says 17 or 18. But the tax on importing the finished goods was 6%. So those kind of policy inconsistencies. Another simple example, the documentation process for importing goods, believe it or not, is less than the documentation process for exporting. I'm not even talking about the ease and the convenience and all of that, just the process. So as a government, we need to align our intention, our vision with our policies, because on the one hand, we tout a policy, but the activities contradict what we intend to achieve. Yes. Another very simple example, we think population is growing very fast. We need to slow down population, but Lagos State gives you extended maternity leave if you're pregnant. Those actions contradict the policy. I'm not saying they shouldn't give extended maternity leave, don't get me wrong. But if our policy is to do something, our activities around the activity have to support the policy. So a lot of policy contradictions exist. Just simplifying or aligning those things is a very easy way to achieve better industrialization. The power thing you spoke about is also crucial. We're not, in my opinion, we're not taking power seriously because we all think of power in terms of charging our phones and using our ACs at home in terms of convenience. But the industries that require this, who are forced to generate their own power and do their own mini plants, what are we doing about saying if you have your own power plants, if you have excess capacity, can you earn from it and distribute? As far as I know, the laws don't allow you to distribute unless it's for your own use. So there's a lot of excess power generation within small entities, and then there's a deficit right outside the compound. Those little things, I think, will go a long way. Just the policy alignment. This is the policy, this is the direction we need to go. These are the activities to support it. Once we can align all that, I think there's going to be an exponential improvement.
Yeah. Thanks, Alonso. For me, I wanted to come next to you. Maybe your thoughts on those same points as well in terms of our industrial strategy and, yeah.
I loved what Zeal said about intelligent or smart, using smartphone analogy, smart taxes, to say use your smart tax to power your industrial vision, which should be the industrial vision or the national plan for Nigeria that is aligned to Nigeria's undoubted potential and opportunities. I didn't like the point about the extended maternity leave, but we'll take it offline.
Yeah, so you're shaking your head.
But I don't think it's not mutually inconsistent with saying that, if the fact I can have one child and have one extended maternity, there are other ways. But anyway, I have to speak for the ladies here. But the point he made about smart taxes, I think, is very crucial. And I think one low-hanging fruit for government, especially and I agree with him that the smartest minds, I have to say, because Mr. Zacchaeus Olusegun is here, the smartest minds are powering our tax reforms. So the smartest minds, absolutely. I think one great low-hanging fruit would be whatever the tweaks for this current tax initiative. And I would say, as I said, on the 2nd, 3rd of December, federal government of Nigeria, Minister of Finance, the central bank governor, the directors and so on, DGDMO, they were meeting investors for a couple of days. And investors said, you know what, we're buying into Nigeria's potential. So, and we're taking a 10-year instrument at 2.2 billion, order book 9 billion. So there are people out there who believe in us, right? If one of the points that came up a lot was the issue of the presidential committee on fiscal strategy and tax reforms, chaired by our esteemed Mr. Oyedele. Now, what I fear is that because there's been so much pushback, there's never going to be a thunderous applause for tax reforms anywhere. Yes. And it will never, just like fuel subsidy, it will never be perfect. It will never be exactly right, addressing all constituencies, including me and including Zeal. We will always be upset when we have to pay tax and pay private school fees and so on. But if you get a good fit, and we're hearing from outside and from analysts that this set of reforms is a good starting point on which to build further. And my fear is that this tax reform will end up being like the Petroleum Industry Act, which is, everybody just nitpicks, and then it just doesn't get passed for years, because there are people out there that want some of the certainty that the new tax regime would have. And I do believe that there's been attempts to try and nuance it so that not just the most vulnerable, the poorest, but also SMEs, who are actually the engine of the Nigerian economy, are not disproportionately taxed, compared, especially VAT-wise, compared to people like Zeal, who, have more capacity and bandwidth to pay those taxes. So smart taxes, I agree with you. I actually do agree. I think where the other low-hanging fruit is, so I say pass the bill if it's, if we can. We've had courage on the fuel subsidy removal. This is an administration that has taken tough decisions. Let's move on the tax reform and then connect the dots. There are other aspects beyond this particular tax reform. There's other aspects that industry will tell you. It's the multiplicity. It's the agency that says, I give you this exception, then tomorrow somebody puts a red X on your building, you can't go in and so on. It's that multiplicity of agencies and actors that is really disturbing industry. And then moving on to the point that you've made about industry that's fit for purpose. I'm not the, we have a new minister, and it would be great for her looking at Nigeria's potential to do a future proofing. What industries, so this is something the East Asians do extremely well, which is to say, what's our set of cards? What are our dynamics? And then how do we incentivize industries that are operating or that are moving in the direction of those particular set of cards? Nigeria has certain unique, you've got a huge domestic market, which has been talked about to death. You've got the youthful population, you've got tech, savviness, and so on. You've got a huge diaspora. You also have a huge domestic diaspora. I was, at the US Embassy the other day at an event, and they were talking about, a figure of maybe up to 200,000 engineers in one form or the other are diasporas, but resident in Nigeria because they're earning from companies abroad. They're earning outside of this current economy. So building on that, looping in on, the educational system, where, the universities, the polytechnics and so on, the institutes of education are pouring out, and this is Minister of Industry and Minister of Education sitting down together and saying, let's align our plans so that the universities have future-proofed, fit-for-purpose, future-proofed agendas that will serve future-proofed industries. Pie in the sky, but it can be done.
Thanks a lot. That was really good. Your comments, they reminded me of something when after Mao died in China, and you then had the reformers come and try to open up China. And one of their guiding principles that I think it was Deng Xiaoping who constantly said that we'll cross the river by filling the stones. They didn't really know how things were going to turn out, but that was just the way to project some kind of confidence and competence while knowing that, hey, we're heading into the unknown in there. So yeah, I think I'm a fan of saying, look, do not let the perfect be the enemy of the imperfect, that sort of thing. Yeah. We've got just a few minutes, but Segun, I would like you to quickly share your thoughts in a minute or two on those same issues, just to wrap up everything that we've said. And then I don't know if we might be able to take maybe one or two questions from participants. But
Yeah. Thanks,
Segun,
Faye.
please refrain from any zeal stray bullets. I'm all taking on stray bullets.
No, not a problem, right? Thanks for me, and thanks, Faye, for the question. So I've done quite a bit of work, right, working on industrial zone, industrial parks, etc., and like on those kind of support for manufacturing. I've also done quite a bit of work with industries, right? And I remember one of my last clients that were in a session with a large conglomerate. You actually also realize that 50 to 70% of input into industrial activities are imported, right? And you then question, see this industrialization, what does it really mean? Because you're not domesticating your value chain. What's really the value creation you get from the industrial sector, if you look at it holistically, right? And that creates a question that we need to take a nuanced view of how we approach industrial development, right? And I like Fumi's point. We can't be everything. We can't support every industry, but we need to take a dispassionate view of the sectors, the product line that we can actually drive and have the potential of practical domestication of value chain that create a lot more value within Nigeria, right? Or because at the end of the day, if most of the industrial companies that you have is doing 50 to 70% of importation of raw materials, etc., and all that, you're bent with the question, what's really the value creation? And the second point I would just like to talk about is around the tax bit, and I'm not just going to talk a bit about the policy, but I haven't done a bit of work sort of working with companies to assess the impact of changes in taxes, on their prospect for growth and all that. Part of what we've seen is that, taxes increase, right, can potentially impact companies in terms of the cost of production and the fact that there's what you call inflexible transmission mechanism between the increase in cost and to consumer, given that there's wage that's inflexible, right? So that's a question that you need to think about. But what we then also see is that there's actually, for clients that I work with, there's scope for tax increase, right? They just want there to be consistency, reduce multiplicity, right? Especially for the bigger companies, right? Which is the point for me made. I think the other bit is then say, look, how do we create a coherence around taxes? I like to put around smart taxes, but I think where we are right now, I typically will tell myself, is that our GDP is not correct, right? Or the potential in our tax can be better explored, right? And for me, my view is the potential can be better explored. I like the point around leakages, they're quite a lot, right? But the efficiency and the coherence across the state level to federal level needs to come in. That's why I also think the tax policy, as much as possible, should be passed and can be refined going forward. Let me just land those 2 points and just pass it back to Faye.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So we've got about maybe 3 to 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask anyone in the audience, if you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand and please get straight to it. 30 seconds, ask your question. And if you want to direct it at any of the panelists, please directly, mention who you want and then ask your question directly. So if you have any questions in the audience, please raise your hand and I'll pick out a few which we can. Okay.
Sorry, just to add to that, Faye, if in case anyone has any question for Dr. Ebike, he's also online, so we can also take it during this time. Thank you.
Okay. Can't see any hands raised. Okay. Oh, okay. I guess maybe the session went quite well so much that nobody has any questions to ask. If there are no questions, I hope we've left you with something. Okay, we've got one. think we have one. Okay, no, sorry. Right. Okay, I hope we've left you with something useful to think about. Again, we can never have all the answers. We can never discuss every issue or every problem in one session like this, but I always like to think that sessions like this work really well as a starting point. So this is hopefully giving you something to think about, and then think a bit more about around the myriad challenges Nigeria is facing, the things that are done, things that are done that we cannot go back into the past. And if we've already made a decision, however painful and difficult it is, let's focus our energies on how to ease the pain. The plaster has been removed. How now can we begin to help our people to get through this really, really challenging period of high inflation, high energy costs, poor transportation, that sort of thing, just so that we can leave behind us? Because, however we think, subsidy was squeezing the life out of the country. We were becoming subsidy with a country joined to it, not a country, in the sense that Nigeria was in service of petrol subsidy. So it was something that we needed to move away from. If we've moved away from it, now, the work starts now, basically. So thank you all very much for your time today. I hope you've learned something, and I want to thank our panelists as well, Fumi Ogunlesi, Zila Karawe, and Shemuzakios. Thank you for your contributions and sharing your thoughts, both from your professional aspect and your personal views as well. Joy, so I think I'll hand over back to you now for you to round up and summarize everything we've had today.
Okay, thank you, Faye. There was actually a question which
Okay.
I saw on the chat group. I think that is for Kristen.
Which one? Okay.
The IMF country reps say countries with forex pegs experience less inflation.
Oh, okay. All right, Kristen. Yeah. So, there's a question here. It says that, did you say that countries with forex pegs experience less inflation, or did they mishear you?
Yeah, I think people should be careful not to attribute this to a causality, just a correlation. Obviously, countries with a peg have always much tighter monetary policy because they have to anchor their policy rates to the anchor country. For example, the CFA franc zone, they always have inflation around 3 to 6%. Because they can't really deviate too much from the Eurozone average inflation. Otherwise, you have the peg that's just going to break apart, right? So that's always what is happening on average. But also the fact that the exchange rate is fixed means that the pass-through to inflation is much more contained structurally, right? Because their currency does not really move much. For countries with flexible exchange rate, yes, they are impacted by movement in their currency, and the pass-through is important there. But at the same time, they're also more flexible countries. So again, it's not that countries should always move towards pegs and abandon flexible exchange rate regime. It's just the fact that when you have a peg, you are more insulated against volatility in your currency, and the pass-through is much more contained.
Okay, Joy, back to you now.
Yes, thank you, Kristen, and thank you all. It seems that there are no more questions for us. And I see a comment on the chat group to invite government organizations to provide some responses. Yes, this is noted, and we would ensure to do this going forward. I think we have come to the end of a very insightful webinar. And I would like to thank everyone present, especially our panelists. Thank you so much, Kristen, for joining us. And thank you, Faye. Thank you, Fumi, Zil, and Shegun. We thank you all for this. And we hope to see you in the new year for another economic update, and then to end of the season. And we do wish you a happy holidays. Thank you, and bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.